Good evening. I'm Megan, a bookseller at Literati Bookstore. Tonight, we're pleased to welcome Claire Boyles to our At Home with Literati series in support of SITE Fidelity. She will be in conversation with Katherine Indermaur. For attendees, the chat is closed, but I will be dropping links to purchase SITE Fidelity from Literati throughout the event. You can also use the Q&A feature on your toolbar to submit questions at any time. I'll ask a selection at the conclusion of the event. A reminder that you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com with curbside pickup and shipping to your home anywhere in the United States. We're also open for in-person shopping. We ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. You can think of it as this week or this month or this year's subscription. Donations can be made at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us. Now allow me to introduce tonight's author and moderator. Claire Boyles is a writer, teacher, and former sustainable farmer. She received her MFA in creative writing from Colorado State University. Her fiction has appeared in Boulevard and the Kenyon Review. She lives in Loveland, Colorado. Katherine Indermaur is a poet, writer, and environmental advocate. Currently, Katherine is an editor for Sugar House Review and the development associate for the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance.
I'm muted, sorry. Thank you. I think we're gonna start with a short reading from SITE Fidelity. And I'm gonna read from a story called Sister Agnes Mary in the spring of 2012. This section is short, it's near the end of the story. And what you need to know is that Sister Agnes Mary is a 74-year-old Catholic nun who has started protesting a oil and gas site behind the Catholic school playground. And her protests so far have not been very effective, and so she's considering further action. And her sisters, Ruth and Mano, are in the scene as well. They are also in their 60s and 70s. Sister Agnes Mary calls inside to her sisters. Time for me to head home. She hefts her tote bag over her shoulder and walks into the dark night. She is through the backyard and 2 houses down the alley when she hears Ruth and Mano. They are shushing each other and giggling, telling each other in loud voices to quiet down. They are louder than normal, the way drunks who are trying to be quiet are always louder than normal. They are faster than Sister, and soon Mano's arm is through her right elbow, Ruth's through her left. She tries to be severe, even though part of her heart kindles when they touch her. You two go home, she says, her voice landing somewhere between a whisper and a hiss. The owls follow the sisters, their calls an alarm. Go home, Sister says again. You'll get in trouble. This sets Ruth and Mano into another fit of giggles. Hear that, Mano? Ruth says. Sister thinks we'll get in trouble. But what about you? Mano says. Last I checked, that's a habit, not body armor. Wonder Woman, Ruth says, red-faced, still laughing. Super nun, Mano says. Sister humphs. You two, she begins, but they finish with her in unison, are really snagging my knits. This only makes Ruth and Mano laugh louder, squeeze her more tightly between them. They've fallen into step with Sister, and the 3 of them move in tandem, like a marching band, on the sidewalk, on the newly greened tree lawns. They are approaching the playground now, the flare stack flame stretching toward the full moon, the chains on the swings knocking together in the chill, steady breeze. They reach the swings and each sister takes one, sits for a moment. Ruth and Mano laugh like loons. Sober up, Sister says harshly. Ruth and Mano stop laughing. Sister reaches into her tote bag, pulls out the U-locks. Her joints ache so badly, she almost loses her grip. I'm going to lock myself to that machine. I'm gonna stop there, just a little taste.
Yay. I love those characters. Thanks for reading, Claire, and I'm so happy to be here with you.
Katherine, I really appreciate you helping me launch this book into the world.
Yeah, of course. It was so exciting to read a book that, you know, had characters in landscapes I knew and talking about issues that I care about. And so that was really exciting. Oh, and I just saw Megan from the bookstore just put a link in the chat to purchase the book if people want to see that. Yeah, so I just was wondering if you could start by talking a little bit about where you're from and how you came to call the West home, and then maybe after that, why you think there's such rich literature and a mythos around the Western American landscape.
Sure. I moved with my family. My parents moved us to Nevada, to Lake Tahoe, when I was 9 years old. And we were from the Midwest, and my parents were really determined to see the West when we arrived. So they took us, we did a lot of camping to national parks, but also state parks and, kind of all around. My dad at the time, I think, was trying to, much like I am now, trying to get into birding and identifying birds. And I still have, he bought these in the early 80s, he bought these really ridiculously heavy binoculars. They're just gigantic. And I still have them. They're so heavy. And I remember he used to like huff them up these trails to these summits with a tripod and like set it all up. And he really wanted to see eagles. And at the time, he really wanted to see bald eagles. They were still very endangered at that time. And it was a really rare thing to see them. So that's how I came to the West. And I came to Colorado for college in 1993. I got my undergraduate at CSU as well as my MFA. So yeah, I've been more or less in Colorado or the West since that time. As far as like literature and the myth of the American West, I think the literature is so rich largely for the same reason like I love the West, and I suspect one of the reasons you love the West is just the dramatic nature of the landscape and the environmental features, and then also the life that has been lived in the West can be really harsh. The weather conditions and the climatic conditions have always been sort of harsh and hard scrabble, and survival is not always guaranteed. Resources are very scarce. And like, as far as a backdrop for the human drama of literature and potential for metaphor, I just think you can't really, I think the Western landscape holds so much promise for that. I'm interested to hear, like your ideas about this too. Like, I know your poetry is very influenced by the West and the landscapes here. And I don't know, what do you think about?
Yeah. Well, it's funny you mentioned resource scarcity, and that's like the number one thing that I thought of when I thought of this question was that there's always been this tension in the West where we have this underlying lack of water, lack of farmable land, lack of hiding places, like when you're out in, we talked shortly before the call began about my background picture, which is in Capitol Reef National Park here in Utah, where I am. And you could see for miles, that's very different from the coastal landscapes and the Midwestern landscapes, where you are just surrounded by trees and greenery, and you feel like you're kind of in the thick of it. And yeah, so for me, it's exactly what you said, is just there's this inherent drama in the sort of visual abundance of the landscape, contrasted with the actual like scarcity of resources that make it possible to really live here year round. Yeah.
I think that's so interesting, when you say the lack of places to hide and how exposed the landscape is. My husband grew up in Pennsylvania, and he always talks about that adjustment to come from an area that's like heavily forested and to an area that is so, it's not barren, that's absolutely not the word, but just open.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think it's funny because yes, there's a lack of hiding places, but there's also a lack of like places where other people could be hiding to ambush, which is how I feel often now when I'm in like heavily forested areas. Like, right. I'm used to it, and I sometimes can feel very claustrophobic. I think it's so interesting, that the safety and danger sort of works both ways, which might also play into literature in an important way.
Yeah. Yeah. I grew up in North Carolina mostly, and I went back home recently for a bit. And I just like driving past all these stands of trees where you can't see, it's like you see the edge of the forest and you can maybe see another 5 feet in, and that's it. I'm like, oh, I bet there are so many ticks in there. Like, that's what I kept thinking about. But,
right. Yeah, absolutely. Ticks are yuck, especially this year.
Yeah. So now that we've sort of situated site fidelity within the frame of Western literature as a whole and literature about the American West, I'm wondering if you can talk about the phenomenon behind the title, because site fidelity refers to a very specific phenomenon in which animals like either stay in a place or return consistently to a place over time. Like sage grouse, which is the animal that you write about specifically with that phenomenon in mind. And that's the title of that story. And a lot of your stories engage what I think of as the ethics of site fidelity. And I mean, you've already mentioned this in the first question, but you know, in a place that it's that you can't hide in, or things can't be hidden from you, and with this resource scarcity, I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about maybe the ethics of site fidelity and things like what we might owe to a landscape like this Western landscape that's very open, or even just a place that we really cherish.
Site fidelity is like the tendency that animals have. It's an instinct really to return to the same places over and over again. It's often tied to breeding behaviors. That's true for the Gunnison sage grouse. They return to areas called leks to do their breeding every year. And it's like where they were conceived, you know, it's families kind of returning back to do their breeding behavior. Fish do it.
Makes me think of salmon. Yeah, salmon swimming up.
Yeah, right. And I mean, I'm not a scientist. I'm assuming other species demonstrate it as well. But so it's a scientific term that I actually learned about while I was writing Ledgers, which is the story that includes the Gunnison sage grouse. There's a series of dams that were built on the Gunnison River in the 1960s, and one of them was built over top of a large Gunnison sage grouse lek. And the year after the reservoir filled, the birds came back to water and ice, basically on top of where they were breeding. And then the next year, they just couldn't manage it. It just didn't go well. They couldn't really breed. They couldn't reproduce. And so then the next year, maybe half as many came. And the year after that, half as many again. And then it just died out. The Gunnison sage grouse in particular have really strong site fidelity to their lekking sites, and they don't adapt. And I think for me, it just became a metaphor for humans also. You know, it's such an emergency. It's so dangerous if you lose the land you rely on in that way to sustain you. And for us, it's almost worse. You know, we are destroying the habitat that the Gunnison sage grouse relies on, but that is also habitat and ecosystems that we rely on. And we have a limited ability to adapt outside of that. So it just became sort of a metaphor for like, what responsibilities do we have to the places that we love the places that we live and the places that we know and the places that we love, but also on a global scale, to the earth, to places we don't know, to places we don't love, but places we rely on or that humanity relies on anyway. You know, water, if we're going to talk about resource scarcity, water in the West is absolutely over allocated. And now with climate change and, you know, aridification, it's just, there's not enough to go around. And we've made it into private property, which is such a strange, I mean, it's really a recipe for conflict and a recipe for problems, you know, that it's always been built into that system, but it's really coming to a head, especially now in the extreme conditions that we're facing. We can adapt, you know, if there's not enough water, it doesn't matter who owns the right. We won't be able to live here if there's not enough water. that will probably be true. So I do see resource stewardship as an ethic, and site fidelity has become a way of thinking about that ethic for me.
Yeah.
You know, saving species and preserving biodiversity it's a goal worth centering, just, you know, really despite humanity. It's a goal worth having all on its own, but humans are so embedded and reliant on the ecosystems that I personally just have trouble entirely separating them from, you know, what it means to the argument that we should be saving the Gunnison sage grouse is also an argument for saving ourselves. And the word,
absolutely, yeah.
So the word fidelity and all the like beautiful connotations of like loyalty and love and connection and entanglements and roots that come with that word just feels like an organizing concept that shows us what kind of emergency we might be in, but also gives us a path to preserve what can still be preserved, maybe, and save what can still be saved. I hope.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it speaks a lot to, like, the word fidelity speaks a lot to the families and the intergenerationalness of a lot of the stories, how you have characters who are related to one another, interweave and reappear over time, and talk about one another and come from one another. But also I was thinking, I mean, what you're saying about the interconnectivity of sort of, I think about like the wildlife human interface, which is like a fancy phrase for, you know, where like human civilization abuts wild space. But I also think about environmental justice and the movement for environmental justice, and how I think there's, in the wake of the climate crisis, which is happening, that there has been a real awakening among our generations that you know, the human can no longer be separate from the environment, and it never was, but we could pretend for a while with our like industrialization and our cities that we didn't really depend on snowpack for our water and things like that. But yeah, so I think a lot about that. And I think too about, I mean, with water in particular, I read an article today that for some reason, Utahns consume the most water per capita of any state in the United States. And which is crazy when you think that a lot of Utah looks like this. There's no reason for us to be using that much water. But like you said, I mean, when we treat it like private property, it becomes something that we feel we're owed, rather than something that we have to take care of and steward. I think.
Right. Or allocate in just and equitable ways, even, you know, like,
yeah,
it's very problematic. And I think it really is a catastrophe, and it's been building. And I think that's really what has been so, it's really been part of what site fidelity came from, is sort of this fascination I have with, we have known this. This is not a surprise. Everyone
right.
said, like, people have been talking about, you know, when we built the Glen Canyon Dam, the activists then said, this dam is going to be obsolete in 50 years. And it is. I mean, or it will be very soon.
It's at its lowest levels. Yeah. And
yeah,
like things that have been covered by water are now resurfacing. It's wild. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, you know, there are projections, like worst case scenario is by even next year, it may not be able to generate the electricity that it has been generating because it'll be too low to run those turbines. So that, I mean, I just think I'm just fascinated by our ability to ignore the warnings that have been around. I mean, we're not talking about like, oh, 2 years ago they warned us. We're talking about climate change has been a known entity for 50, 60 years, you know, that people have known about it and really refused to act in a meaningful way to stop it.
Right. I mean, there are a lot of ways that the climate crisis is sort of emerging in different parts of our culture. We're seeing in the movement of environmental literature generally, which has been around since literature has been around, we're seeing a lot more writing on the topic of climate crisis. And I'm curious, and this might come more specifically from the poetry side of things where I live, but there is a lot of talk about how in eco-poetry, you can't write about climate or the environment today without elegizing it. That in some way, every eco poem today is an elegy. And for people who aren't familiar with that, an elegy is traditionally a poem or a song that mourns the loss of usually a person, a loved one, laments somebody's death. So in other words, today's environmental literature mourns the loss that the climate crisis is bringing and has been bringing to us for some time, as you said. So would you, Claire, talk a bit about that idea, maybe as it relates to the book, and maybe you don't see that at all happening in your book, or you see it in some ways, or you see it, but you hope that's not the case. I'm just curious, like, how that phenomenon interacts with SITE Fidelity, the book, not the phenomenon.
I think elegy is really essential to climate fiction. There are things that we have lost that we will not get back, and things that we are losing that we maybe can't save. And I think it's really important to grieve that. I mean, without, love and grief are intertwined. And I think it's important to grieve the things we're losing. And I also think, in climate fiction, it's often envisioning the world after climate catastrophe and what that might look like and how we might need to live and different ways we can imagine society being. And I think that's also really essential work. I don't see SITE Fidelity as really either of those. I think SITE Fidelity is more an examination. Again, I guess I'm just going to repeat a little bit what I probably in my last answer, but I wanted to look closely at these seemingly small local environmental catastrophes, like a fish kill or the irrigation canals and dams and how we get our water and how we store water in the West, and just kind of look at these things that we've decided to accept and that we've decided to allow. I mean, fish kills I had no idea how common fish kills are, but they really are fairly common in rivers, I think worldwide, but I only really know about this area of Colorado. And it's a little bit, I feel like the general sense is like, well, there's a certain number of fish kills we're going to have to accept in order to build the roads, that there's no
can you talk about that a little bit? Because I think I understand what you mean when you say fish kill, but you're talking specifically about like human caused pollution causing like a big die off of fish in one river or something like that, right?
Yeah, it happens really frequently when like construction is being done near a river, on a road near a river, and a certain chemical will be released, and it'll just, as it flushes down the river until it dilutes enough, it'll just kill all the fish that it comes in contact with. Or sometimes it's like a hazardous materials spill from a car accident on a road near the river. And I had never really thought about it before. I'd never known that I had witnessed one. I still don't know that I have, but I think it was back in 2016, I just read in my local paper, there was a story about a fish kill that happened. They had to rebuild the road to Rocky Mountain National Park along the Big Thompson River after a catastrophic flood in 2013. And there was a fish kill caused by that construction. And it affected the drinking water. Like Loveland, the city I live in, had to switch its drinking water intake from the river to the reservoir because of the possibility for contamination from this fish kill. But the article was published maybe 3 months after the fish kill had happened. And it was very much like, everything's fine. It's all okay. I mean, I had no idea that that had happened. So I guess I just wanted to look at like the idea that we've come to allow that, or that we look at the big dams, you know, in so much of the country in the West, we are starting to examine dams and think like, do we need them, or can we take some down? And some are being taken out. And in Northern Colorado, they're building them. We're just building more of them. Where, you know, there's 2 that are more or less, one in my town, and then one, probably at least one on the Poudre River, that are probably going to be approved and built. And it's a little bit like, well, there's no other way. There's no other way around this. So I think the way we start to accept these things locally, anyway, to come back to site fidelity, I just am really interested in what that conditions us to accept on a global scale, and how action or ways of living that might improve local conditions or remediate maybe some of that degradation could translate also into demanding that from our national politicians, you know, and global politicians to like really get some action. So yeah, I think I like to live in optimism, and I think for me, elegy doesn't help me stay in that optimism. But I think I wanted site fidelity to be hopeful. You know, I wanted the characters to confront real problems and not lose their sense of hope or their sense of possibility. So yeah, there was a fish kill in the St. Vrain River just a couple of weeks ago. There was an accident, and it was a big fish kill in a river near my house. And an artist named Sally King painted a huge sign and put it out on the highway next to the river. And it just said, "All fish died." And it was kind of this beautiful,
Wow.
colorful art. And yeah, I think to me, that is elegy and examination. That's both, right? Like, this happened and we can't take it back, but let's examine it and really think about whether we're going to allow this. So yeah, I think it's really a powerful statement when art can do both things, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot about, just like on a somewhat selfish note, that like in my work for the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, I'm constantly balancing, like, because I do fundraising writing. And so I will say, here's a problem, but here's what we're doing about it, right? Like, yeah, there's this balance of optimism with the reality of what's happening. And like, the threat is real and it's severe, but we have these tools and we're working on these other tools, that's, and in some ways that feels to me like a pretty privileged point of view, to be able to say like, oh, well, let's spend some energy stoking the optimism or something like that. And but yeah, a lot of the characters in Site Fidelity are motivated not just from sort of a sense of like everything will work out, but from, like you've talked about, a fidelity to place and to their family and to kind of the legacy they want to leave. And I feel like that's really powerful.
I wanted the stories. I think, I read a lot of poetry. I'm not a poet, but I love poetry. And I think, the difference writing fiction or trying to write climate fiction just is the character development. And I wanted the stories to be stories about, I love having discussions about climate and the West. And, but I do think like the stories, it can sometimes make it sound like Site Fidelity is very much like almost like a very political book. And it is a political book, I think, but I think it reads, I hope anyway, that it reads just like stories of humans and families that are facing these issues that are kind of in the background of their lives. And then when they come to the foreground, it connects to the emotional journey of the characters, because I think that has been my experience of living in the West, that these issues, these policies, and these, the way we've decided, the extraction mentality that sort of drives, I think, commerce in the West, and the way we look often, the way society as a whole will look at the land in terms of like oil and gas or agriculture even, or mining. I mean, those are legacies of the West that are not serving us, and I think are really can be harmful to human relationships. And so I wanted to have those things be in the background, but also try to show how humans are living in relationship to those things and how they are affecting actual human lives.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm spacing on her last name, but Leah, who's the founder of Intersectional Environmentalism, which is like moved beyond where it started just on Instagram, but is this movement with environmental justice at the forefront. But she recently shared, I think it was a tweet, but has been cross-posted everywhere, about how, you can be, I don't know if celebratory is really the right word, but you can be glad that we are transitioning away from coal and dirty fossil fuels in the West. At the same time, you can also say, well, what about the people who held those jobs? And what are we going to do for those people and those families and those towns and those schools? That you don't need to pick one or the other. We can care about the environment and our communities. And I think about that a lot in terms of where the political and the personal sort of appear and intersect and interpenetrate in your book.
I mean, I think I think communities are better suited to do that than the companies anyway. It's not like oil and gas has been in a boom and bust cycle since it started, and it rolls into these communities and leaves them flush during the booms, and then it rolls out during a bust. And it's not as though the industries themselves, which we could hold them accountable for breaking that cycle, it's part of just absolutely the economic lie of it, I think, is that this is somehow like a good economic driver to have these cycles. And
it's never been sustainable. Yeah,
that's right. It is good when it's good. But it has to be like, families aren't boom and bust. Families need food every day and, housing every day. And so, and in the West, I think in particular, our relationship to individualism and, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You can't expect, I think that's a really harmful relationship that we have, that, even I find myself like having to uninternalize the things I have been taught around, how much can we be self-sufficient in the world? I just don't believe we can anymore. I just, for me, it's all about community and family and really the globe. We can't let the rainforests go and expect it to not affect us here. So
right.
We are all in it together. And SITE Fidelity takes a kind of a specific view, but of this sort of region, but I do find that those issues sort of circle out, in my head anyway, maybe not in my stories.
No, I think they definitely do. That reminds me of, teaching creative writing to students and sort of revealing that the magic in a lot of creative writing is specificity leads itself to universality. And they're like, wait, what?
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
You talked about what did that sign say? All fish died.
Mm-hmm. All fish died. Yeah.
And I really am drawn to, there's one particular story, and I will try not to like reveal too much, but one particular story in which artivism or art activism takes a really central role in the plot. And it seems to me, and there are a few different types of activism that your characters are engaged in throughout the book. And one, this is sort of how I'm thinking about it, and correct me if obviously if this doesn't line up with what you're thinking, but one of those kinds of activism is a destruction of destruction. So like, you know, blow up the bulldozers, like blow up the road, blow up the dam, those kinds of things. Not that those are things that happen in the book, but classic monkey wrenching kind of stuff. And then there's creation from destruction that can draw attention to that destruction, like painting a sign that says all fish died. And so artivism, I think, falls into the second camp always because you're creating from the destruction or from the potential destruction. But artivism is also risky because with any artistic endeavor, the intended meaning or like what you're hoping people will interpret from the art as the artist is ultimately up to that audience or the reader or whoever to decide. So it's possible that like one of your characters runs into that the activist message can get lost in translation. So what are your thoughts about this risk that art takes, especially when it comes to activism? For example, does it make art a less effective means of activism, or maybe effectiveness just isn't the right way to think about it at all? What do you think?
I mean, so in that story that which is early warning systems, yeah, the character does sort of this grotesque sort of art installation, and it's absolutely, you know, the community is just like, what is this? And they don't see it at all for how she intended it to land, which was as a protest. I wrote that scene really, like, I wasn't thinking too deeply at the time about art or how art lands or what art means. I just really was trying to add some levity to that story. I just thought it would be funny, you know, if like
it is funny.
Yeah, like you try these things and you know, people don't respond. I also, when I wrote that story, the book was already under contract, and I knew that it would be, you know, that these stories would be like, I had been writing just for myself and like my MFA workshop, and I knew that these stories would be getting a wider audience. And, you know, it took a few drafts before I was like, oh, that's my anxiety, like on my sleeve, you know? Like,
yeah.
But
which is probably how I'm coming to this question, is I'm just reading my anxiety into your book.
I mean, even with the fact that her art is not really well received or misunderstood, or at least that seems to be the overall effect of it in the story, I don't think, I mean, I don't see the character Mayno as experiencing any kind of regret for having created. I mean, she's horrified by some of the interpretations, but I don't think she has regret for creating the work itself. I mean, art, I think, is a really imperfect site for environmental protest, but it also might be the place of most possibility for breaking through our really polarized politics of the environmental moment. Like, I think stories and art can, it's a sense, it hits you at a sensory level. However, there's visual art or a story that, you know, hits your heart. It's an emotional language. And I think an emotional reaction can change someone's mind. And I think there are a lot of people in the West across the political spectrum who love the land, they love wilderness and they love the land, and they're connected to it in a number of ways that go beyond economics. So I do think art has that potential to change minds or to affect someone in a way that, you know, maybe different kinds of rhetoric don't, or rhetoric, you know, and I don't want to get into whether art is a rhetoric. I'm not waiting for that. I don't want to go there. So
that was my next question. That's too bad.
Yeah, sure. In the July Harper's magazine, there's an essay by the poet Tess Taylor. I think she's a poet. Yes. Anyway, it's about the subtitle is art.
She's also done some farming. I don't know if that's what her article is about.
Yeah, actually, I heard her read. I think she came to CSU while we were there.
She did, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Anyway, the subtitle of the article is Art as Civic Repair. And it's kind of an examination of what art the role art serves in Belfast in the wake of the Troubles, you know, in terms of maybe not creating, but maintaining peace and fostering peace. And it's not uncontroversial, you know, but you know, she really makes a case for the possibility that art could help. Art might be a way we could start to heal the partisan divide and bring people back to a more reasonable way of engaging with each other and engaging with the issues like the environment, but not limited to the environment, that we really do need to engage with. You know, we cannot continue to just live in different worlds of facts. And so I think I want to believe in that personally as a human, and as a writer, I want to believe that it has that power. And I think the only way to see whether or not it does is to put art into the world and be ready for people to misunderstand it or challenge it or critique it. It's definitely been part of this process, is like developing a thicker skin for people who,
Sure.
you know, who see my work differently than I might see my work, and also like taking that criticism to heart when it's valid and trying to let that criticism make me a better artist, you know. So I don't know, I guess I think sometimes it's good when people misunderstand or critique, and it's no reason to stop making art. You know, art has potential. It's worth the risk, I guess. And I think it seems worth the risk, but I also think in life, it's worth the risk.
Yeah. And I think also, you know, the flip side of the coin where there's the risk that people will misunderstand your art. I think the flip side of that, where, you know, art isn't an objective reality where we're like, well, these are the facts, right? And so for me, the flip side of that is that everyone has a valid way of interacting with art, whether it's creating it or reading it or interpreting it. Like, and for me, a lot of these issues that you talk about in the book are very overwhelming. And like, even as somebody who in my day-to-day life, I do a lot of reading about issues of like resource scarcity in the West and over recreation in the West and what's happening to certain areas in Utah. And so even as somebody who has a little bit of more literacy than the average person in this realm, it's still really overwhelming, but I can still make a sign that says all fish died. I can still march at a climate rally and with a sign I made. I can still write a story or sing a song, and that's valid. I don't have to be a PhD level scientist to get involved. And I think that's maybe for me, like, yes, there's that risk, but there's also the inclusivity of it that's really attractive, you know, and useful.
Yeah, absolutely. And even when it, I think even when, or maybe even especially when it's not, when art is not, I mean, I think all art is political, but I think when it could be maybe even more collaborative or public and like something that people are, I mean, that's in that Tess Taylor essay. I've been thinking about it so much, you know, just that like the act of participating in a group experience around art can move people close together because you're sharing something. Even if you disagree about what it means, you are often sharing a moment of engagement with some kind of beauty or interesting thoughts, you know. So
yeah, absolutely. Which is something that hopefully we're returning to a little more now that the pandemic is hopefully subsiding a little bit, but
I hope so.
More communal art experiences.
Yeah, I miss people. I miss readings, like face-to-face readings. And you know, although I think the accessibility of the virtual space has been really powerful. So
definitely. I guess people could still put questions in the chat if they have them, but I am going to just keep asking you questions for a little while longer, if that's okay with you.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. But I want to make sure we save time at the end to talk about your Yuva chapbook correct?
Oh yeah, yes.
And, talk about what it's about and how people can, I mean, my copy is on pre-order. I can't wait to get it. But
oh yay, good. Yeah, it just went up for pre-order. So yeah, I could talk about that then. So we have talked about kind of the importance to you of character development in this collection. And I think in particular, because like what's so attractive to me about the collection is short stories are always hard for me as a reader because I really enjoy the little worlds they create, but then you kind of have to let go of that world to move on to the next one. And in this collection, there's some interweaving, which is great. And so I really like that just personally, but depicting all of these people and these families over the course of many decades across the stories gives a sense of some of the longer timescales we're talking about when we talk about things like land and sustainability and legacy. And I think I was thinking as I was reading your collection about, I got to see Robin Wall Kimmerer come speak pre-pandemic in Salt Lake City. And she's a Native American poet and ecologist. And she asked the audience, what kind of ancestor do you want to be? Which is a really powerful question. And I think it is so powerful because it brings up the questions of environmental sustainability and community in such a personal way. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about the relationship as you see it between family and land. Is it as simple as wanting to preserve the experience you had so your children can have it and sort of caretaking the resources or places that we love for future generations, or is it slightly more complicated for you in the book?
I think the book I hope the book reflects sort of my sense of how important family is across time and how much it sort of matters what the generations that came before us did and what they did not do, and the kind of responsibility that leaves us with. But also just the relationships that carry and the love that carries. And in the collection, most of the characters are taking care of each other or someone. They're taking care of ailing parents, or they're raising children, or they're, actively working through their jobs to better their community, and so or their art, or, whatever means are available to them. They're not all caregivers, because I think, women can be many things. It doesn't have to be tied to care. But I do think no matter how that care is expressed in a family or in a community through time, which is why really I'm interested in smaller towns and rural spaces, just because they kind of allow community to develop even outside of family. I think just that what do we owe each other, and as the mother of two teenagers who have a lot of questions about how did we end up in this mess, and whose experience, we took our kids into the wilderness, and we took them to places in the wilderness that were destroyed last year by fire. And so I do feel like I should have maybe known better, right? Like I should have known better than to tell them, like, this trail in Rocky Mountain National Park has been here and it will be here. This is a protected space. And it's not, it's gone. That whole, we backpacked up a drainage to the tundra a couple of years ago. And that is exactly the drainage that burned in the East Troublesome fire. And that's where in the tundra, it jumped across, they never thought it would jump across the Continental Divide. There's not the vegetation. They didn't think to support it. And this fire was able to jump that space. So I guess I do think that the way families care for each other, if they're caring for each other well and intentionally, helps, and the way people care for their own communities, because I think that's something that many people can see and engage with and feel, can then translate out into caring for the globe, caring for the earth in a way that makes it safe for life, like whether it's sage grouse or children or disabled parents or fish, whatever it might be. I think those relationships with community and family are where we learn the ethic. And I think of caring for land and caring for all of our ecosystems, the whole ecosystem. Ideally, I don't know that it always works that way, but I think ideally that is also a space for hope for me, that what we do in our lives can translate into demanding systemic change. That if we have an ethic of caring for things in our day-to-day life in meaningful and intentional ways, that we then expect that from everyone in our community and everyone in our leadership and on every level. I do think that matters.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, not to make it too simple of a dichotomy, but that I really like the idea of the family being sort of the start of the ethic of care and caretaking. And I think in a little bit of contrast to that about like the ethic of labor and what we do to sustain our families that occurs outside of the home. And I don't know, I don't have any like insightful thoughts into that, but I think that comes up a lot in conversations around living in the West, but also in the book a little bit. And how like motherhood and working outside of the home and making that's also a kind of care, and sort of extending that care out into the world can start in that way as well.
I think we saw that a lot when we were farmers trying to grow vegetables and flowers and raise chickens and pigs and kind of have this diversified, agricultural operation. And just the way that you cultivate that and the way you have to tend it and the forces around you that make it impossible to just tend your own farm, like whether for us it was the oil and gas boom that just felt like it was, it was closing in on us. There were just flare stacks everywhere and trucks and development all around are like organic. They weren't certified, but we were growing them organically, these vegetables. And you just really wondered, like, what are we giving people to eat? What are we eating ourselves? And that affected our own relationships. My husband, our like marriage and the way we raised our kids and the way we interacted with our neighbors and all of those things were affected. It's not like these things exist over here. I have found that those things are absolutely, it's really what drove me to want to write stories about these topics, is that I feel like they're so connected.
Yeah, it's not like you close your front door and then suddenly the farm is out there and you're a different person, right?
Right. Or like if you don't have the local farm, like if the local farm we get our food from now, if they can't make it, then what is our alternative and what are the ethics of that alternative? And what does it mean that they can't afford to buy their own land or water or whatever else? Like all those things are so important for a community too, outside of the family and within it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's just the three of us left. Is that right, Megan? Yeah.
Yeah. If you wanted to talk about your chapbook really quick, and then I'll wrap it up.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Claire. Yeah, I have a chapbook that is coming out in July. It's called Facing the Mirror, an Essay. It's from Coast No Coast, which is a small independent press out of Seattle. And it's a prose poem. It's one long prose poem. And it is, it came out of my thesis that I was working on at Colorado State, which is where Claire and I met. And that portion of the thesis talks a lot about the history of mirrors and how mirrors were invented and how they've sort of appeared throughout history and across science and faith and used for Black magic and things like that. But kind of the the mythos of the mirror and also my relationship to them. As somebody who has a compulsive disorder where mirrors can be a trigger for symptoms. And there are a lot of people who have issues like that with mirrors in particular. So kind of our fraught relationship with the mirror culturally as well as personally. And it's pretty funky, but yeah, you can pre-order a copy right now.
Please do. I can't wait. I can't wait for mine to come.
Thanks, Claire.
Cool.
Katherine, thank you so much.
Yeah, I look forward to reading it, and this will be posted on our YouTube page. So thank you everyone for joining us for At Home with Literati tonight. Thank you, Claire Boyles and Katherine Indermaur. And thanks to our viewers. Make sure to buy the book. The link is in the chat. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.